It was a typical Friday afternoon, the kind where you think you have the whole weekend ahead of you, full of promise, yet you never anticipate how quickly things can change. The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting a golden hue over the endless stretch of asphalt. Traffic was light on the highway, a rare gift during the rush hour, and most cars hummed steadily along as the occasional gust of wind swayed the trees by the roadside. It was the sort of peaceful drive that made you feel at ease, a momentary break from the chaos of life. But for the Williams family, this calm would shatter in an instant. As they cruised along in their old minivan, the hum of the engine suddenly sputtered, then groaned, before coming to a shuddering halt. The smell of burnt rubber filled the air, and the lights on the dashboard blinked like the warning signs of a bad omen. Katie, the mother, tried to turn the key once more, praying the van would just start. But nothing. Silence. A sinking feeling settled in her stomach. She tried calling roadside assistance, but with no service in this remote stretch of highway. The only thing she could do was look out the window at the setting sun, knowing they were miles away from the nearest town, with no idea how long it would take for help to arrive. Her husband, Greg, tried to lift the hood, hoping for some miracle, but deep down he knew there was no miracle coming from that engine. It was a situation no one ever really plans for, especially on a seemingly uneventful drive. And as the minutes stretched on, that sinking feeling was replaced by something more primal: worry. What if no one came by? What if the kids, Max and Lily, got restless and scared? What if they were stuck out here for hours or worse, overnight? Little did they know, their lives were about to take a dramatic turn. One that would not only change their day, but possibly their entire perspective on who they were as a family, and who or what could show up when you least expect it. And then, as if on cue, a car approached on the horizon, its headlights cutting through the dusk. But this wasn't just any car. This one would change everything for the Williams family. Katie's heart skipped a beat when she saw the headlights, not from relief, but from uncertainty. There was no guarantee this would be someone who could help. They could be another passing motorist, just another face in a world of too many strangers. She looked back at Greg, who was still fiddling with the hood of the van, wiping sweat from his forehead as he muttered to himself. He'd always been the fixer in the family, but today even he seemed out of his depth. Max, their 12-year-old son, shifted nervously in his seat. "Mom, what if we have to stay here all night?" he asked, his voice betraying more fear than he'd meant to show. Katie smiled weakly, trying to reassure him, though she too had the gnawing feeling in her gut that told her this might be more than just a quick pit stop. "It'll be okay, honey. Someone's bound to come along soon." But as the car in the distance grew closer, that familiar sense of dread crept back in. Was it just another random traveler? Or was there something about this car, this moment, that would push their day into an entirely different direction? When the car finally pulled up beside them, it wasn't just a random sedan. No, this was a sleek black Tesla, the kind you'd only expect to see in a fancy showroom or on the streets of a major city. The doors opened silently, revealing a tall figure stepping out, his movements calm and purposeful. Katie's first thought was how out of place he seemed. Everything about him, his clothes, his confident demeanor, seemed to belong to a world far removed from the gritty reality of their stranded van. Greg, noticing him now, straightened up, wiping his hands on his jeans. "You need help?" he asked, though his tone was more a question of curiosity than anything else. The man smiled, a warm, almost knowing grin. "I might be able to help," he said, his voice smooth but with an edge of something unmistakably authoritative. Katie's brow furrowed as she glanced at her husband. Who was this guy? How could he be out here on such a desolate highway, driving a car that cost more than their entire van? And why would someone like him stop for them? Greg hesitated for a moment, then nodded toward the van. "We've got a dead engine. I'm not sure what's going on with it. I'm no mechanic, but I can't figure it out." The stranger didn't respond right away. Instead, he just walked to the front of the van, taking in the situation with an almost clinical curiosity. There was a quiet confidence in his steps, as though he were assessing the situation from every angle, seeing it in a way that the Williams family couldn't. Katie stood at the side, holding her breath. She glanced at Greg, trying to gauge his reaction, but the look on his face was one of surprise, even awe. For a brief moment, the world seemed to stop. This man was out of place, too composed for a simple mechanic, too polished for a mere passerby. Finally, the man turned back toward them. "It's the alternator," he said simply. "But don't worry, I've got the tools. We'll get you back on the road in no time." Katie blinked in disbelief. "You can fix it?" He gave a nod. "I've got everything I need right here." Max looked up at the man, still trying to wrap his mind around what was happening. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice full of both wonder and confusion. The man's smile deepened, though there was a hint of mystery to it. "Let's just say I'm someone who knows how to fix more than just cars." Katie's stomach tightened at the stranger's words. Who was he? And how was it possible that someone like him was here, on this deserted highway, ready to help them, in a way that seemed almost too perfect to be true? The uncertainty lingered in the air, but at the same time, there was something undeniable about his presence, something in the way he stood there, as if he were exactly where he needed to be. In the span of a few moments, the trajectory of their day had shifted in a way they could never have anticipated. The quiet, uneventful drive had now become a turning point, a moment that would forever alter their understanding of help, and perhaps of the very nature of life itself. The warmth of the man's confidence, his easy assurance that he could fix their van, was starting to sink in, but Katie couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Her instincts told her to be cautious, to ask more questions, but Greg seemed eager to trust him. Maybe it was desperation. Maybe it was the glimmer of hope that had faded over the last hour as they waited, but the fact that someone had stopped, let alone offered a solution, made it hard to resist. Greg glanced at her, his expression softening. "I think he knows what he's doing," he said, his voice tinged with hope. He had been the rock of the family, the one who solved every problem, but now, with the situation spiraling out of his control, this stranger was their only hope. Katie's gaze flicked to Max, who was staring at the man with wide eyes. She could see the mix of awe and uncertainty in his face. He too was struggling to process this new, unexpected reality. They were stranded, but they weren't alone anymore. This man had appeared almost like a lifeline, but lifelines had a way of being pulled from under you just when you needed them most. The man, who still hadn't given his name, squatted beside the van's engine, pulling out a sleek toolkit from the back of his car. His fingers worked with the precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times, removing screws and clips as if he were in the comfort of his own garage. But then, just as Katie started to feel the faintest flicker of relief, something went wrong. The man's hands paused mid-motion, a subtle furrow forming in his brow. He muttered under his breath, his usually calm demeanor slipping for just a moment. Greg took a step forward, his voice tinged with concern. "Is something wrong?" The stranger's gaze flicked up, and for the first time, his mask of calm cracked just enough to reveal the tiniest glimmer of doubt. "It's more complicated than I thought," he said, his voice steady but clipped. "The alternator's damaged beyond repair. We'll need a new part to get you moving." Katie felt the pit in her stomach deepen. How could they have gone from hope to helplessness so quickly? She could feel the frustration rising in her chest. They had been stranded for over an hour already, and now this stranger, this person they were depending on, was telling them that the one thing they had hoped for, getting back on the road quickly, wasn't going to happen. Max's face fell. "Does that mean we're stuck here longer?" Katie gave him a strained smile. "We'll figure it out, honey," she said, though her voice was far less convincing than she intended. Greg's face tightened. "How long will it take for someone to bring us a new part?" he asked the man, though he already knew the answer. The stranger's gaze flickered to the horizon, the line of road stretching ahead with no signs of movement. "It could be hours or even overnight. There's no service station nearby." His words hung in the air, heavy and real. Katie's heart sank. She felt the weight of the situation press down on her chest. What would they do now? This wasn't just an inconvenience anymore. It was a major setback. No one was coming to help. Not the way they thought, anyway. The man stood up slowly, wiping, his hands on a rag. He turned back toward them, his expression unreadable. "I'll make some calls," see if I can get you the part you need. But it's going to take time." The silence that followed was thick with tension. Katie could feel herself on the edge of panic. It wasn't just the van, it was everything. Max's restlessness, Lily's quiet anxiety in the back seat, the unease gnawing at Greg's usually unshakable demeanor. This was turning into a nightmare, one that felt like it had no easy way out. She wanted to be the voice of reason, to assure everyone that everything would be okay. But in that moment, even she wasn't sure if they were going to make it out of this. As the man walked away to make his calls, Katie's mind raced. Why had he really stopped? What did he mean by more than just cars? There was something more to this stranger, something beneath the surface. And now, more than ever, she was beginning to wonder if their encounter was just a coincidence. As the minutes turned to an hour, Katie couldn't sit still. Her eyes kept drifting back to the man, who was still on the phone by his car, speaking in a low voice she couldn't quite hear. There was a sharp edge to his words now, a tone that didn't match the calm, collected person they had met just moments ago. The idea that this man might be hiding something bigger than just a mechanic's knowledge, lingered in her mind, gnawing at her thoughts. She stepped away from the van, unable to stand the silence any longer. She needed to talk to Greg. "Hey," she said, walking toward her husband, who was leaning against the hood of the van. His face was drawn, his thoughts clearly occupied with the same worries that had taken hold of her. "Are you okay?" Katie asked, her voice softer than usual. Greg gave a half-hearted shrug. "I don't know. I thought we'd be out of here by now. He said he'd call. But what if we're just waiting for someone who won't show up?" Katie's gaze flickered to the stranger, still on the phone. "I'm starting to think there's more to this than just a broken van. I mean, how did he find us so quickly?" Greg frowned, his brow furrowing as he considered it. "What do you mean?" "I don't know. I just don't buy it. He was too calm, too perfect. The van broke down in the middle of nowhere, but he just happened to drive by? He seemed to know exactly what was wrong with the engine without even looking at it first." Katie's words tumbled out faster than she could keep track, but she felt it now. The unsettling, nagging suspicion that something wasn't right. Just then, the stranger turned and began walking toward them, a look of determination on his face. He pulled out his phone and checked it briefly before meeting their gaze. "I've got some news," he said, his voice different now. Not the friendly stranger they'd met earlier. There was an edge to it, something sharp that cut through the quiet. "There's no part coming. At least, not from where I thought. We're going to have to make this work another way." Katie's heart skipped a beat. There was something about the way he said it, something about the way his eyes flickered briefly to the horizon that set off a whole new alarm in her mind. The sense of urgency, the change in his tone. Something had shifted. This wasn't just a van issue anymore. It was something far more urgent. Her pulse quickened. What was he really here for? Katie's breath caught in her throat. The moment the stranger spoke those words, "We're going to have to make this work another way," something inside her clicked. She glanced at Greg, whose face had gone pale, his eyes narrowing as he tried to process what was happening. But it wasn't just the van anymore. No. Something much bigger had entered the scene. Something that they weren't prepared for. "Wait, what do you mean, make it work another way?" Katie's voice was firm now, and though she wanted to remain calm, a part of her was starting to unravel. The stranger didn't respond right away. He just stood there, hands tucked in the pockets of his jacket, his eyes calculating. The weight of his gaze was unsettling. Greg shifted uneasily next to her, but before he could speak, the man took a step closer. "I'll be honest with you," he said, his voice lowering. "I didn't just stop because of your van. I'm not a mechanic, at least, not in the traditional sense. I've been watching you all afternoon, watching the way you were sitting, waiting. I knew you'd be here." Katie's mind raced. "Watching us? You've been watching us?" She was about to ask why, but the answer was already sitting, at the back of her mind, creeping like ice. The man nodded. "It wasn't random. This was always supposed to happen. I was supposed to be here to help you. But not in the way you think." He paused, letting the words sink in. "You're about to face something much bigger than a broken van. Katie's heart pounded in her chest. Max and Lily were still inside the van, unaware of what was unfolding. Her first instinct was to run to them, to protect them from whatever this man was saying. But something stopped her. She had to know more. What's going on? What do you mean, bigger than a broken van? Who are you? Her voice was shaking now, but she couldn't back down. The man sighed, his eyes softening for just a moment, as if deciding whether to reveal the truth. Finally, he spoke again, this time in a tone far more urgent. You don't understand yet, but you will. The world you think you know, it's changing, and you're a part of it now. Katie felt a chill crawl up her spine. A part of it? What was he talking about? I've been watching you because there's something important you need to do. Something that's tied to all of this. Your family, your journey. There's a force at play, a chain of events that's been set in motion. The van is a symbol. The moment you broke down here, I knew it was time. Greg stepped forward now, his face pale but resolute. What are you saying? This whole thing. This isn't about our van? Are you telling us this was planned? The stranger nodded. Yes. But it's not just the van. This isn't about technology or mechanics. It's about you. It's about a choice you're about to make. He turned his gaze to the horizon, his eyes dark and distant. The world will shift with your decision, and you're standing at the precipice. Katie felt as if the ground beneath her feet had vanished. This was beyond anything she could have imagined. Everything she had taken for granted, the simple family trip, the mundane moments, had been leading up to this. Her pulse quickened as the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. No, she whispered, her voice barely audible. This can't be real. You're telling me this is all about some choice we have to make? The man's eyes met hers, piercing through her like he could see her very soul. Yes. But the choice isn't just yours, Katie. It's all of you, the whole family. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. And once you decide, there's no going back. Katie's mind was swirling. There was no way out of this now. She could feel it. This was the moment that would change everything. The moment when their lives would never be the same. She looked at Greg, then at Max and Lily inside the van, their faces innocent and unaware. This was her family. And this was the point where everything would either crumble or evolve. Her breath hitched. What kind of decision was this? And how could she possibly make it? Katie stood there, frozen, trying to process everything the stranger had just revealed. Her thoughts were a jumble of disbelief and fear. A choice? What kind of choice could possibly change the course of their lives? Was this man really telling the truth? Or was this some sort of bizarre game? She wanted to deny it all, to shout that this was madness, but she couldn't. Something deep inside her, something she couldn't ignore, told her that the world had just shifted in a way she couldn't fully comprehend. Greg stood beside her, tense, his fists clenched. He was quieter now, his usual practicality overwhelmed by the weight of the situation. Katie could see it in his eyes, the same fear she felt creeping up inside her. They had been thrust into something they didn't understand, and there was no going back. The stranger's words hung in the air like a heavy fog. Katie looked at him, her voice barely above a whisper. What do we do now? What kind of decision are you talking about? Her heart was pounding, her mind racing through every possibility. The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he seemed to study her, his eyes filled with a strange mix of urgency and sorrow. There are forces at play in the world that most people never notice. Forces that shape everything. And today, you and your family are at the center of one of those forces. Your choices will ripple outward, far beyond what you can see. He paused, as if weighing his next words carefully. But you must act. Soon. Katie's head spun. The idea of making some world-changing decision was terrifying, overwhelming. She turned to Greg, looking for some sign of clarity, but all she saw was the same uncertainty mirrored in his eyes. Max and Lily were still in the van, oblivious to the gravity of the situation. Katie's chest tightened as she thought of them. So, Young, so innocent. What did this mean for their future? What did it mean for her future? The man stepped forward, breaking the silence. You're stronger than you realize. Your family is more than just a group of people. You're a catalyst for something greater, but only if you embrace it. Katie took a deep breath. She had always prided herself on being the steady one, the rock. But now, standing at the edge of something so much larger than herself, she understood. The decision wasn't just about fixing the van or choosing a path. It was about embracing the unknown, about trusting that they had the strength to face whatever came next. She looked at Greg, her voice steadier now. I don't know what this all means, but we'll face it together. Whatever happens, we're in this as a family. Greg nodded, his jaw set. Together. The stranger's expression softened. That's the first step. Katie's heart seemed to steady at his words. She took one last look at her family, her heart swelling with a sense of protection and love. No matter how strange or frightening the path ahead might be, they had each other. That, she realized, was the true force at play, the strength of family. The man turned, giving them one final look. Good luck, he said, his tone now strangely reassuring. And remember, the choices you make aren't just yours, they shape everything. With that, he walked back to his car, the Tesla's engine purring to life once more. He didn't look back as he drove away, leaving the Williams family standing at the edge of a new world they didn't yet understand, but were now destined to explore. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the family climbed into the van, their hearts heavy, but their minds open. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, Katie felt ready. Ready to face whatever came next with her family by her side, and with one final breath, she whispered to herself, "We can do this." The van's engine roared to life.